With rising global tensions fueling economic instability, an upsurge in nationalist sentiment shown by right-wing parties gaining popularity, and countries implementing measures against immigration, many fear the potential return of a certain 20th century ideology. Because the state this ideology establishes is often defined by checking off broad features applicable to many liberal democracies, concern around its return often lacks an understanding of what this form of state truly is and how it differentiates from the democratic structure we are all familiar with. Further, special attention is given to this form of government's secondary attributes, such as its mysticism or anti-intellectualism, while its main function and the conditions it addressed are either briefly mentioned if not entirely ignored. These two factors are essential to understanding this ideology's base of support and how it was able to draw this base in. Without involving these points in an analysis of this system's original rise to power, one is unable to compare the current situation to that of the past, a comparison crucial to answering whether it is rising once more, or if it even has to. As many states throughout recent history have been described to be fascist, it is important to address why this description is more often than not falsely applied in order to understand what this societal structure really is. For the purpose of this video, your opinion on the writers used, whether positive or negative, is completely irrelevant. Both Bordiga and Trotsky provided a great early analysis of fascism, regardless of the contents of their other works. Where in 1929 most communists believed Soviet Germany was imminent, Trotsky saw through the cope and predicted otherwise. Bordiga wrote his analysis in 1922 after directly witnessing fascism succeed in Italy. The contents of his work echo much of what Trotsky said, but provided a better analysis of the connection between liberal democracy and fascism, which enriched Trotsky's findings. If you consider both to be fascist themselves, then who better to learn about fascism than these two? Fascism is not just military dictatorship, although the two concepts are understandably conflated as the former's development makes it increasingly indistinguishable from the latter. Where the two differ is in their synthesis, with military dictatorships lacking key characteristics which make fascism, well, fascism. Military dictatorships do not conflict whatsoever with established military institutions, utilizing them from the get-go to establish power. On the other hand, fascism emerges from a situation where the military cannot be used in this fashion, leading to the creation of military organizations outside the state, such as Douche's black shirts or the brown shirts of his disciple. In Fascism, What It Is and How to Fight It, Trotsky describes the differences between these two forms of state by comparing Mussolini to Primo de Rivera, Spain's dictator from 1923 through 1930, stating,
"The dictatorships of Spain and Italy are two totally different forms of dictatorship. It is necessary to distinguish between them. Mussolini had difficulty in reconciling many old military institutions with the fascist militia. This problem did not exist for Primo de Rivera."
As an aristocrat, Rivera was well established within the Spanish ruling class. His coup was achieved with state and military aid granted by the high position he held in both. This is the case with many regimes commonly referred to as fascist. Pinochet, for example, was a high-ranking military officer like Rivera. While the state plays an indispensable role in the rise of fascism, its leaders did not emerge from established parties or institutions. Instead, they were outsiders without previous experience in state. Hitler and Mussolini both had careers demonstrating this, with the German assuming power a year after taking his first government position as chancellor, and the Italian marching on Rome the same year he was first elected to parliament. As outsiders, these leaders did not represent any particular ruling class interest in the way a usual state official does, showing another major difference between fascism and military dictatorship. In a report on fascism, Bordiga explained that
fascism is not a current of the bourgeois right, based on the aristocracy, the clergy, and the high civilian and military officials, seeking to replace the democracy of a bourgeoisie government and constitutional monarchy with monarchical despotism.
With ties to the aristocracy or armament industry, the military dictator seizes the state in order to advance the interests of a specific section of the ruling class. In contrast, fascism serves a much broader interest, something which also distinguishes it from the democracy it emerges from. Fascism and liberal democracy both serve the same function, ensuring bourgeois domination over society. Additionally, both utilize similar tactics to achieve this task. In his report on the matter, Bordiga describes the way fascism gains influence among the masses, stating,
"We see here an imitation of the classical stance of bourgeois democracy, when it is asserted that all interests must be subordinated to the superior interest of the nation. That means that class collaboration is upheld in principle, while in practice the conservative bourgeois institutions are supported against the proletariat's efforts to free itself. That is the role that liberal bourgeois democracy has always played."
Under liberal democracy, the state is said to be governed by the people for the people, while neglecting class which may divide said people. We see that while presenting the state as a benefit to all, it ends up benefiting a select few. In the United States, for instance, popular legislation proposals such as universal health care, which offers taxpayers a cheaper alternative, are somehow never discussed and never will be, as they go against business interest. What is this if not class collaboration on paper, but class domination in practice? Liberal democracy is quite good at this task until faced with existential crisis, where it fails to serve the bourgeoisie to the best of its ability. While still able to make maneuvers to avoid complete collapse, action must be taken to restore the apparatus to its former capacity. This requires the abandonment of a key characteristic of liberal democracy, the power struggle between parties representing different ruling class interests for the advancement of said interests. Such a conflict only breeds division, which is fatal under crisis, as it requires uniformed planned action. Fascism solves this issue by binding the ruling class. In Report on Fascism, Bordiga describes this stating,
"Through its contact with the entire bourgeoisie, the Fascist Party represents in a certain sense what the Communist Party is in Russia, thanks to its relationship to the proletariat. That is, a well-organized and disciplined body that leads and supervises the state apparatus as a whole."
As a revolutionary vanguard unites the proletariat under a concrete plan towards revolution, the Fascist Party unites the bourgeoisie under a concrete plan for crisis management. Funding for the NSDAP demonstrates this, with all sections of the ruling class pitching in. Finance capital like Dresdner and Deutsche Bank, industrial capital like United Steel Trust, large landowners called Junkers, and firms so large their activities spanned industry and finance, such as IG Farben, all joined forces in support of Hitler. Italy saw a similar intersection of ruling class interests, initially gaining the support of the agricultural bourgeoisie, and eventually winning over the industrial bourgeoisie who would plan the March on Rome. Upon this consolidation of power, ruling class parties leaned in to support Dusch's new government, with a cabinet reflecting this. Despite possessing conflicting interests, such as German heavy industry's desire to expand into Junker territory, all groups were bound by the precarious position which the economic crisis had put them in, and the measures which were required to take them out. Although the ruling class was united during crisis, it was not the sole factor in this development. An economic downturn is not reason enough for the unification of the capitalist class. If it were, then all countries following the Great Depression would have become fascist. Although there were failed attempts, such as the business plot in America, the reality is that if the bourgeoisie truly wanted it, truly needed it, they possessed more than enough money and resources to ensure success. One only has to look at the German ruling class, who in 1932 presented Mussolini with plans for Central European expansion which failed, but were later made possible with measures taken by Hitler after assuming power a year later. The difference between countries which resorted to fascism and countries which did not was the ability to access extra capitalist outlets, such as colonies, to serve as a field of capitalist investment. Germany was unable to expand into new markets and lost all colonies, leaving its advanced productive apparatus constrained. Similarly, Italy received none of the overseas mandates or colonies it had expected. In comparison, the United States gained a dominant economic position, while Britain took over former German colonies and fertile crescent territories. Without these advantages, the only way companies could handle economic crisis and avoid bankruptcy was at the expense of labor. Working wages had to consistently go down, while worker productivity had to be maximized. Any resistance to this had to be handled, meaning that the bourgeoisie had to ensure, as Trotsky put it in Fascism, What It Is and How to Fight It, that
workers' organizations are annihilated, that the proletariat is reduced to an amorphous state, and that a system of administration is created which penetrates deeply into the masses and which serves to frustrate the independent crystallization of the proletariat.
State power is contested as the proletariat organizes itself and gains strength. Measures which could otherwise be taken with ease, such as the elimination of child labor laws, are no longer feasible due to guaranteed resistance from unions and other worker organizations. Facing complete economic collapse, the ruling class must join forces to destroy this obstacle. Either workers must fall, or capitalism itself will. In both Italy and Germany, fascism was a response to the immense power possessed by workers standing in the way of proper state function. Italy's situation after the First Great Imperial Conflict is not so well known, likely due to its limited scope. Having printed money to purchase arms, inflation rose, rendering savings worthless and raising the cost of living. Demobilized soldiers were dumped onto the labor market, causing unemployment to skyrocket. Revolutionary sentiment swept Italy as a result, and the socialist current, with its consistent anti-war stance, gained popularity. Urban workers in major cities were primarily driven into trade union struggles, leading to a wave of factory strikes across Italy in 1920. Proletarian strength was particularly potent in the countryside, resulting in the agricultural bourgeoisie retreating to the cities. In Report on Fascism, Bordiga used the economically important plain of Po as an example of this situation, stating it looked
like a local dictatorship of the proletariat, or at least of the rural workers. The Socialist Party had won control of many municipalities at the end of 1920 and instituted a municipal tax policy directed against the agricultural and the middle bourgeoisie. We had flourishing trade union organizations there, plus significant cooperatives in many branches of the Socialist Party, and even where the movement was led by the reformists, the rural working class took a revolutionary stand. The employers were forced to pay taxes to the organization, a certain sum that would provide a sort of guarantee that the employer would respect the contract imposed on him by the trade union struggle.
Trotsky believed this to have been the real deal. In Germany, the proletariat was also an obstacle which employers had to overcome. Despite the revolutionary sentiment having dissipated after the failed revolutions of 1918 and 1923, German workers were still incredibly strong, reflected by a union membership outnumbering all of Europe. Following the 1929 crash, measures were taken by the state to cut wages but proved insufficient, with the economic crisis demanding more. Upon further pressure, the German workers began to resist. As Rethel put it in The Economy and Class Structure of German Fascism,
the employers and the government still insisted on further wage cuts, but now the workers were no longer in the mood to accept such measures. The result was an aggravation of the class struggle throughout Germany. A growing militancy of the workers spread throughout the major industrial centers. At the beginning of November, a spectacular strike broke out in Berlin involving over 20,000 transport workers.
It was clear that the German bourgeoisie had to handle proletarian organizations in order to continue its assault on the working class. Only brute force could handle the issue faced by Italian and German owners, but economic crisis and accompanying social unrest made use of military difficult as it risked further aggravating the situation. A political solution was required, for which the bourgeoisie turned to another class it brought ruin to. To combat the power of the proletariat, the bourgeoisie must mobilize the middle class. Otherwise known as the petite bourgeoisie or middle strata, this class is composed of small business owners, small landholders, the self-employed, and generally those who do not live on selling their labor power or entirely by extracting surplus value. Unable to compete against large firms with infinitely more capital and productive forces at their disposal, this class finds itself in a very precarious position. Faced with slim profit margins and the constant encroachment of monopoly, the middle strata is economically dependent, atomized, and divided. As a result, it is not in an economic position to constitute its own policy, to determine its own future, instead having to follow the bourgeoisie. Generally, the middle strata is content with this position provided the market is stable. However, as Trotsky explained in Fascism what it is and how to fight it,
under the conditions of capitalist disintegration and of the impasse in the economic situation, the petty bourgeoisie strives, seeks, attempts to tear itself loose from the fetters of the old masters and rulers of society.
Economic crisis brings ruin to small businesses, who are unable to handle a disruption of cash flow with their thin profit margins. Faced with bankruptcy and pauperization, this class grows increasingly antagonistic towards institutions and representatives who fail to provide the economic stability it needs. With these sentiments festering, the petite bourgeoisie demands action but finds no cause to act on. This drives it into the hands of the very source of their misery. As Trotsky describes it in his work,
Fascism unties and arms the scattered masses. Out of human dust, it organizes combat detachments. It thus gives the petty bourgeoisie the illusion of being an independent force. It begins to imagine that it will really command the state. It is not surprising that these illusions and hopes turn the head of the petty bourgeoisie.
Since fascism has no previous experience in the state and represents no specific ruling class interest, it is able to seem like the change the middle strata demands. By laying out a clear course of action, the bourgeoisie offers them an outlet for their frustration. In turn, their frustration is directed away from capitalism, the very source of their ruin, towards a new target. Bound to aggravate a country's economic situation through strikes and political disturbances, proletarian activity is presented as an obstacle to their prosperity. This portrayal was made possible through the blunders of the proletarian movement, which allowed the bourgeoisie to exploit an attitude the proletariat had failed to capture.
As we stated earlier, fascism initially struggles to reconcile with old military institutions, requiring a formation of new special bodies. An illegal reactionary force beside the state must be built of a different composition from its own class. Of course, this force could not be drawn from the proletariat, so ready to take initiative and make change. How could it? Workers are the target of such an organization. Instead, as Bordiga put it in his 1922 report on the matter, fascism
recruited forces from the layers that are closest to the proletariat among those discontented because of the war, among petty bourgeois, middle-level bourgeois, merchants and traders, and above all among intellectual bourgeois youth. In joining up with fascism, they find themselves again the energy to lift themselves morally and cloak themselves in the toga of combating the proletarian movement, achieving an exalted patriotism in the interest of Italian imperialism. These layers provided fascism with a significant number of supporters and enabled it to organize militarily.
The very necessity for fascism to establish a new reactionary body is inherently tied to the conditions from which it emerges. In Fascism, What It Is and How to Fight It, Trotsky beautifully explains why fascism must do this, stating,
"It is often impossible to make the army march against the people. It begins by disintegrating and ends with the passage of a large section of the soldiers over to the people's side. That is why finance capital is obliged to create special armed bands, trained to fight the workers just as certain breeds of dog are trained to hunt game."
This is certainly not a constant. For example, the Paris Commune was destroyed when the French army re-entered Paris. If it were, high-ranking officials would be unable to utilize their influence within the military to stage a coup and establish military dictatorships. There is, however, one condition where this is fact, where soldiers join the population they are meant to suppress, that condition being revolution, as we have previously explored. Only the revolutionary sentiment amongst the masses makes it an impossibility to pin the military against them for risk of the two joining. I edited this audio myself, so I don't know if they're going to cut this out, but subscribe to Unajoy 10K 2025.
Upon examination, the failure of revolution to either succeed or take off played a decisive role in fascism gaining support from the petite bourgeoisie. Italian and German workers were burdened by a party completely incapable of acting in a revolutionary manner, both repeatedly making mistakes at the expense of the proletariat's unity and direction. As a result, the petite bourgeoisie had no confidence in the proletariat's ability to better their conditions. In Italy, the Italian Socialist Party, or ISP, believed it could work with the state due to its left-wing character. When the government began formation of the Royal Guard, a military force which would later assist fascist goons in terrorizing workers, the ISP offered absolutely no pushback despite constitutional grounds to contest this as the construction of a second army. In September of 1920, the aforementioned industrial strikes culminated when armed workers occupied factories across Italy. With the agricultural proletariat making moves towards occupying the land, the state had to respond intelligently and swiftly. Since military force threatened to escalate the situation, Giolitti, Prime Minister of Italy at the time, offered to pass legislation officially recognizing worker control of factories if workers stood back. With the ISP's failure to unify the interests of the agricultural and industrial proletariat under the greater goal of revolution, immediate interest prevailed, leading factory workers to take this offer, one which was never fulfilled. Rising unemployment would only weaken the industrial proletariat so long as their struggle remained untransferred from the trade union terrain to that of revolution. Mistakes such as these would ultimately kill revolutionary enthusiasm. In Report on Fascism, Bordiga described this course of events, stating,
It can be said that in 1919 and 1920, the Italian bourgeoisie had somewhat come to terms with the fact that it would have to witness the victory of the revolution. The middle class and petty bourgeoisie were inclined to play a passive role, following in the wake not of the big bourgeoisie, but of the proletariat, which was on the edge of victory. But now the mood changed fundamentally. Rather than witnessing a proletarian victory, we see instead how the bourgeoisie is gathering its forces for defense. As the middle class saw that the Socialist Party was not able to organize itself to get the upper hand, they gave expression to their dissatisfaction. They gradually lost the confidence they had placed in the proletariat's determination and turned toward the opposite side.
While Italian fascism came at the close of a revolutionary situation, events like the 1923 revolution allowed German fascism to arrive at the dawn of one. Class conflict sharpened that year as strike waves swept the country following the French invasion of Ruhr, an industrial area in Germany. After strikes forced the resignation of Kuno, chancellor at the time, the state entered crisis and was unable to exert influence throughout the country. Workers turned to the KPD after losing confidence in the SPD and union officials. Despite this, the KPD believed that revolution was not near and indefinitely postponed its preparation. As the situation intensified, the party actively tried to hold workers back to avoid unprepared revolution. After months of hesitation, preparation finally commenced when the KPD entered a coalition with the SPD in Saxony and Thuringia. These workers' governments were meant to pave the way for revolution, but failed to stock food and weapons or organize factory committees. The KPD proposed a general strike to protect these workers' governments from the approaching army, but stressed it could only commence upon unanimous agreement from union officials and social democratic leadership. SPD and union leaders predictably shot this down, resulting in the KPD retreating and giving up on revolutionary preparation. Hamburg never got the memo calling off the general strike, leading to an insurrection which lasted for 5 days before the German army suppressed it. KPD leadership quickly acknowledged that a revolutionary situation had gone to waste and accommodated by declaring revolution to be around the corner, further proving its inability to analyze the situation when this revolution never came. Over the next decade, the KPD would continue acting in this way, losing the influence it had gained in 1923 as workers became disillusioned. When the next revolutionary situation was established by the 1929 crash, fascism had already secured the support it needed since, as Trotsky said in The Turn in the Communist Internationale, and the German situation.
The petty bourgeoisie does not wait. Consequently, for the new disappointments in the ability of the party to improve its fate, it bases itself upon the experiences of the past, remembering the lessons of 1923, the capricious leaps of the ultra-left course of Maslow Thelman, the opportunist incompetence of the same Thelman, the clatter of the quote-unquote third period, etc. Finally, and this is the most important, its lack of faith in the proletarian revolution is nourished by the lack of faith in the Communist Party on the part of the millions of social democratic workers.
Having seen the proletariat to be incapable of saving them from the situation they find themselves in, the petite bourgeoisie run towards fascism, which allows them to feel as though they are taking matters into their own hands. A comparison between the current situation and that which gave rise to fascism reveals that fascism is not developing, or at the very least it isn't developing in America. While reactionary, the candidates in elections labeled as fascist fail to meet the criteria since they don't emerge from the rank and file. Donald Trump, for example, may have been an outsider to the state, but is very clearly tied to the capitalist class as an owner of a vast real estate empire. Economic crisis may be looming, but liberal democracy doesn't have to utilize fascism because workers' organizations have already been weakened if not entirely destroyed, and countries still have access to extra capitalist outlets. Additionally, the role of unifying the ruling class has arguably already been fulfilled by the two-party system in the United States, with both parties generally representing the same broad range of capitalist interests through lobbying. The middle strata, though growing discontent by the current economic situation, can still tolerate following old bourgeois institutions and parties, such as the Republicans. Since the workers' movement is in a very compromised state, particularly in the United States, the petite bourgeoisie has not even had a chance to get disappointed by the proletariat and seek a solution to their situation in fascism. Despite this, people may say we are arguing over semantics and that things are getting bad regardless of whether it can be labeled as fascist or not. Presenting what fascism really is goes beyond semantics and prevents liberal democracy from being absolved of the very real, horrendous activity it can engage in. One mustn't forget that the Nazis were directly inspired by America's forced sterilization campaign and inhuman treatment of migrants in Santa Fe. While Germany forced minorities into ghettos, the land of the free enforced segregation. As fascist Italy was conquering Ethiopia, Britain and France brutally held together some of history's largest empires. Liberal democracy is perfectly capable of everything that fascism does, the latter just has to overcome an obstacle. And now, a word from our sponsor.
If you're interested in Alfred Sohnrethel and his book The Economy and Class Structure of German Fascism, I've actually been editing a new edition of the book. I've added several additional footnotes to each chapter to give more historical context to contemporary readers. I've been uploading a new chapter to my Substack every Saturday at noon, and you can find a link to the new edition in the description of this video.